Welcome back, everyone. Now, I'm so happy to introduce our panelists, Paul Mescal, who plays Connell, Daisy Edgar Jones, who plays Marianne, director Lenny Abrahamson, and producer Ed Guiney. They worked together on the film Room, for which they were both Oscar nominated. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Antonia.
So, Ed, I'd really like to start with you because, well, the story of this show really began with you. It was you that first pursued Sally Rooney's novel before it had even been published. What was it that really made you think, I need this material?
Well, we got the manuscript about 2 years ago, and we'd already been developing conversations with friends. Sally's first novel as a film initially, and we got the galleys at the same time as the rest of the world, and there was part of me that was thinking, well, Sally's probably not going to want to option her second book to the same production company, and I was sort of half hoping that maybe I wouldn't really like the book, but of course that didn't happen. You know, myself and my colleagues, Emma Norton and Chelsea Hoffman, Andrew Lowe, we all read it, completely fell in love with it. It really announced itself as an incredible possible television series, just given that it was over time and it was focused on these two characters, this incredible love story. And we have a long history with Lenny Abrahamson. In fact, it goes back many, many years because Lenny and I were in Trinity together and first started making films in the university that's featured in Normal People. That's when we first worked together. And since then, we've had the pleasure and privilege of working on all of Lenny's film and television. So we, it was obvious that we should show him the book, and he read it immediately, absolutely loved it, signed up for it, totally saw it as television. And then we were in a kind of dialogue with BBC, with Rose Garnett, who's the head of BBC Films, who was reading the book at the same time and talking to her all the time about it. And when they found out that Lenny was interested in directing it, they basically made the very bold step of greenlighting the series on the basis of the book and Lenny's interest. And so it meant that we could go back to Sally at that point and say to her, look, I know there's loads of interest from all around the world in your book, but if you give it to us, Lenny will direct it, and we promise that we will make it. There's no ifs or buts or development, hoops to jump through. We're going to make this thing. And I think because she was such a big fan of Lenny's, and maybe because we were Irish, and because the BBC greenlit the show, Piers Venker greenlit the show, we got the book, and that really is what began the brilliant journey.
And Lenny, you told me, I think it was you that told me that you and Ed have actually known each other since you were 15, so well before college, which is it's lovely, that history you have. Was this just a no-brainer for you?
It was, yeah. It was one of those ones where I was sort of, after a few pages, really knew that I just felt really strongly about it. Just had that feeling that comes sometimes where you can see something and you can kind of taste it and you know what it will feel like and how you should try and do it. And it was such a captivating book to read. I felt like, and I think everybody will say lots about this, but it kind of deals with young people and first love and that period in a person's life in such a kind of wonderful way. It's, in a sense, quite simple how Sally writes, but it ends up getting to really quite deep places. And I love that she seemed to take young characters seriously and tell their stories with kind of truthfulness and texture and depth. And I think in that sense, it's also very fresh, allowed for us to do something quite fresh on television and something which is tonally a little bit different. So for all sorts of reasons, which all are rooted in the novel, yeah, it was a no-brainer.
Now, Paul, I know that you had done a lot of theatre work, but this was your first television show. Daisy, I'd seen you play Olivia in Cold Feet, and I know that you're still relatively new to television. Tell me a little bit about the casting and audition process. I believe, Paul, you were cast first, and then you were sort of on your own for a while you guys were looking for Daisy. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was doing a play in Dublin at the time, and it came through kind of as most auditions do, through your agent, and so that it was based, or it was an adaptation of Normal People. Furiously read the book, and then it's kind of one of those bizarre audition processes where you're kind of used as an actor, I think, to getting parts that you're like, I can see 10 other actors playing that part better, or that's a total stretch. Whereas this one, I was kind of like, I felt like I fitted the break, I fit the breakdown, and that I kind of had an idea about if I was to play it, how I would go about doing it. So there's no kind of hiding places in that sense. And then I did my first audition, and then I met Lenny before Christmas, and that seemed to go well. We liked each other. And then there was that kind of awful Christmas hiatus where I had been told that I was very much in the mix, but there was kind of that, like, everybody goes on their holidays for 2 weeks. And then I was called back to the first set of chemistry reads with 5 actors for Marianne, but I hadn't been given the part. And then between that set of chemistry reads and the one where I met Daisy, they Ed and Lenny and everyone at Element put me out of my misery, thank God.
What about you, Daisy? Was there a moment when you knew that this had really clicked? I mean, I did have an audience question about this actually from Lana Cho. She said, did the actors do a chemistry screen test? And I think Ed had told me that when you, Daisy, came to Dublin for the chemistry read, everyone was in tears on that day. Is that true? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, which I didn't know whether if that was a really good sign or a really bad one, but I normal job really tears. But yeah, I mean, that was quite. I'd never had that before, and it was a very strange day because I'd sort of had my initial self-tape that I'd sent off, and it was about 2 weeks later when I got the call that I was down to the final 5. And you know, I'd read the book, and I'd fallen so deeply in love with the character that I felt so anxious, you know, on that audition day, because I knew that that was sort of my only chance. And it was very strange because, you know, I was sort of flown over in the morning, and I sort of spent the whole day psyching myself out, and then I kind of had a quick, like, 2-minute chat with Paul before the audition where I kind of strung some form of sentence together, and then we were kind of in the room. But I think what was really lovely is, you know, I think Lenny has a really wonderful way of creating a really safe space in an audition process. It felt very much like a workshop. It didn't feel like you were having to kind of prove anything. It just felt like you were able to kind of explore and have fun, which I hadn't had before. And I think, I don't know if you feel the same, Paul, but it very much felt like we clicked into a sort of rhythm of Marion and Connell very, very quickly. And that's a really lovely feeling when you kind of immediately know that you're having a dialogue of some kind. You're not having to work towards anything because you kind of are in sync in some way. And yeah, we did a couple of scenes, and then we did one which was the scene at the ghost estate, and everyone cried, and that was kind of, I didn't know, yeah, I kind of didn't want to overthink that because you can get your hopes up, and then when I left, I remember Lenny said to me, he was like, I'm really glad you came. And then I was like, oh, no. I spent the whole week being like, oh, what does that mean? You know, chuffed when I got the call on the Friday that I got the part.
Could I just officially apologize to both of you for the stress that we put you through? It sounds so horrible now that we hear it back.
We've been waiting for months.
I'm so sorry.
So you guys, in approaching this, and this is for everyone really, in approaching material that was already really well loved, obviously you've got Sally on the case writing, and she's there and involved, that really must have helped. But it must have been, you know, quite intimidating to inhabit characters that people already have ideas about. So can you talk a little bit about how you handled that?
Yeah, it definitely is, you know, because, you know, I fell so deeply in love with the character, and I think Sally has such a special way of writing where you can't help but feel like they're really very real when you read the book, and that their world is yours, and it's quite a personal experience reading that story. So I knew it was quite a daunting task to then, you know, try and, I guess, put that into a visual form and represent that character. But I think what was really great is, you know, both Paul and I had a very big amount of trust in Lenny's vision, and therefore we knew that we were always going to try and, you know, keep on the right path when it came to the tone of trying to represent the story, because I think it's such a story based on realism and naturalism, and that's, you know, what Lenny's really useful at doing, and telling perspective in a really special way. And so I think that was good that we felt very safe in his hands. But I guess, you know, also having such a depth of detail about your character's inner mind, and also the way your character physically represents themselves, because you have each other's perspective when it comes to, like, I can read Connell's chapters for Marianne's physicality and Marianne's chapters for her thoughts and feelings, which was quite amazing to have, you know.
Lenny, you know, I think something you and I've talked about before is that your approach to having this really close camera, and you know, that really, for me, watching the intimate scenes was what made them so I suppose personal. It didn't feel voyeuristic, it felt very different. You feel in the scene. It's very emotional to watch. Can you talk a little bit about how you developed that, and when you knew that that's how you were going to approach these scenes, because they're quite intense scenes?
Yeah, I think our sort of our principle, and I talked a lot about this, particularly with Susie Lavelle, who's this brilliant cinematographer that you know, so responsible for how things really feel. You know, it was a collaboration with her. We talked a lot about how we could kind of stop it feeling like, you know, there was some big leap or change when the drama shifted from dialogue and, you know, ordinary, in quotes, life to the intimate scenes. And we just didn't want there to be this shift in style, or this kind of special treatment. We always wanted an audience to feel that we were continuing the story of these two characters and how they relate to each other in those scenes, that it wasn't just some sort of like, you know, added sort of other dimension. It was deeply part of the fundamental kind of story. And part of the way of doing that, I think, was to continue what we were doing in the rest of the scenes, which was to spend quite a lot of time very close to the characters, and with very shallow depth of field, and with close-ups which felt like sort of like there was a kind of searching quality to them. They weren't over carefully framed. They were like attempting to see something, you know, trying to give the audience that feeling like they're discovering something that's really happening, that they're not being spoon-fed. And then, so it worked really well that when the characters were kind of being physically intimate with each other, to continue the story of what was happening on their faces and between the two of them, and relationally, you know, so they didn't just suddenly become bodies, which I think is what often happens in sex scenes. You've got characters, and then suddenly you've just got these bodies. And it was really important that we never left the character, you know, and as simple as that, just to stay with the characters. And in fact, if you look at the sex scenes, an awful lot is played on just on the faces of Paul and Daisy. And that seemed to just that style worked really well to unite those scenes with the rest of the drama. But of course, it's also to do with, I think, how brilliant the guys are at embodying those characters. You know, they don't their understanding, I think, of the characters they're playing was so well formed that it was always fascinating for us to look, and we could always discover, like, we could always find more story depth, even in scenes which were, in a sense, not kind of like pushing the story forward in any obvious way.
You know, I think the close camera on the face is really interesting, because what Paul and Daisy, for me, what I notice so much is that there's this, you see emotion under the surface that's being hidden, which is a real feat to achieve as an actor. And actually, I have an audience question kind of along those lines for Paul, from Ahmed Cindy, who says, how did you get in and out of the headspace of such a complicated character like Connell?
I suppose it goes back to the material, and kind of what's great about doing an adaptation of a novel is that you've constantly got that as a companion throughout the shoot. And obviously working with Lenny throughout rehearsals and kind of from the audition process, I had a very kind of clear idea about how it would kind of work on set. And in terms of coming in and out of the character, I think that's part and parcel of the job, because you have to be available and attentive to your director so that you can discuss the character objectively, but then you've got to be able to step into it and play him. And I think the harder that job is, the better the character is, if that makes sense. And I think Connell is somebody who is, yes, very complex, but I think what Sally has set up so beautifully is that she's given you little breadcrumbs along the way in terms of going about playing him, like little kind of tics or like mannerisms in terms of how he lets out breath or how he's kind of non-verbal in certain instances, and that gives you real kind of physical into playing him. But it was kind of through conversations with Lenny and Daisy, and obviously just kind of rereading the book throughout the shoot.
I think, I was trying to pin down why this show had such a huge emotional effect on not only me, but everyone I've spoken to that's seen it. And it's a perfect storm, of course, like any good piece of work. But, I think it's certainly that it has an effect on younger people because they relate to the characters, and older people because they are filled with regret for the things that they didn't do. Has there been any interesting feedback from people? I think Daisy, you told me at one point when we were chatting before about someone saying to you that they had got back together with their high school boyfriend or something.
Yeah, I spoke to somebody a couple of weeks ago who told me that they started up a dialogue with their high school sweetheart, and I had another lady who told me that she's branched out and gone on a socially distant date, so that's nice.
That is nice. It's very inspiring to people, this show. And also, I think it very importantly doesn't shy away from very serious issues that mostly get glossed over. With, say, Connell's mental health, Marianne's relationships that get really destructive later in the season. And actually, Daisy, what did you make of what was going on with Marianne when she was making those choices?
Yeah, I think Sally writes about it so beautifully. Marianne, she has a really kind of tricky time with her, view of herself. I think throughout the story, Sally talks about it, and in the scripts as well. And there's a scene where Marianne says, "Well, I think I'm just a fundamentally cold and lovable person," and I think that's something she really believes. And I think that's something that Connell really introduces to her is this idea of being able to love herself and feel settled, which is a really wonderful thing. But I think when it comes to episode 9 particularly, she's in a really kind of bad place where she becomes very sort of dissociated, and she doesn't quite know what she wants, and she kind of explores a side of herself that's quite tricky. And I think it's really beautiful to see that, the effect that Connell has actually had on her in making her realize that she doesn't need to, view herself in such a bad way. And I think that's what the show does so well, is it kind of shows how fundamentally how important it is to surround yourself with relationships that actually develop you as a human. And that's what Marianne and Connell really do for each other. They, through the smallest actions, actually fundamentally change each other's lives for the better. When Marianne suggests he goes to Trinity, and then Connell kind of helps her discover the goodness that is her truth, and I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Absolutely. One of my favorite relationships in this show is between Connell and his mum, Lorraine, played by Sarah Green, who's just fantastic. And I think it's really important to show those kinds of other kind of dynamics that built who he is. And I love the fact that you've got this disparity between what Connell has at home and what Marianne has at home. Can you, Lenny or Ed, both of you talk a little bit about developing that side of Connell's life with his mum and the casting of Sarah?
Yeah, I'll very happily talk about Sarah all day because she's so fantastic. And Ed has had the pleasure of doing a few things with Sarah, because she did a wonderful film called Rosie, and she also is in Dublin Murders, both of which are Ed is producing. So she's sort of part of the family in that sense. But it was the first time that I'd worked with her, and she just has an incredible natural warmth, which is the central feature of Lorraine. You know, it's that strength and fundamental sort of goodness. And she's the perfect Irish mammy, and like there's a sort of type that she represents, or is the best of, which is that type of parent who doesn't take any crap from their kid, you know, and at the same time loves them unconditionally. And it's a really wonderfully healthy relationship that they have. And it is interesting that Sally chooses to make the single mum and the young mum the really functional parent in the story, you know. And it's a wonderful character that she's created. So Sarah then brings this, she's also funny, and she's just such a great actress. And Paul and her, I think, Paul, you can talk about this, they just sort of hit it off in such a great way that, and which you can feel on screen.
Yeah, no, totally. Like when I found out that Sarah was going to be playing my mom, because I've watched Sarah for years, both on screen and on the stage in Dublin, and like I'd heard from like friends of mine that she's like not only like, because I'd only seen her in a professional sense, but everyone else was saying to me that she is the most gorgeous person to be around. And like as Lenny said, she just brings this like gorgeous atmosphere to set that makes you really feel like as an actor that you can play with her and like try things out. But then also she can like flip this switch. Like there's a scene in episode 3 where you feel the power of Lorraine and her morals, and like how she's just she's a straight die in that sense. It doesn't, as Lenny said, she doesn't let Connell away with anything. And I think that's why the relationship is so strong, because he knows that the book stops with her. He can't pull the wool over her eyes, so he has to confront them with her. And I think she plays that scene in episode 3, and also towards the end when she kind of softens a little bit. Just that whole journey with her and acting with her kind of day in day out was just a gorgeous experience.
Her scenes too, and I think in episode 3 is it the bit where she won't get in the car, she won't stay in the car.
That's what I love that.
Such an amazing moment. And also I forget which number episode it is, where she hugs Marianne really warmly, and it just gets you, you know, it's just the most moving moment. I absolutely love that character. But I also wanted to talk a bit about the way that you guys handled Connell's mental health, because there was no kind of tidying it away. There was no, and obviously it's there in the writing, but the way that you did it visually is to see him at the therapist's office really sobbing and talking about looking for his identity and feeling so lost and empty. Can you talk about the decision to really lean into that? It feels very important to show that on screen.
I mean, I'll say to give huge credit to Hetty MacDonald, who directed the second block. That's one of her episodes, and I think she did a stunning job on it. And Paul can speak to that process and that such an important day's shooting in the overall story of the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Hetty in that, like, because episode 10 was one of those ones for me that I was looking at kind of like, it's both exciting and terrifying at the same time, because again, it goes back to, you're looking at an episode that's incredibly well written, but in terms of like putting the focus on his mental health is, I think, to hark back to what Lenny said at the start in terms of what the book does and what I think the series does so well, is that it takes these two young people's lives incredibly seriously, both their romance and also the difficulties that they experience. And I think the mental health stuff, I think it's hard to view it in isolation just with episode 10, because you see all the stepping stones. You see, like in episode 2, when he can't ask Marianne to the depth, he's a full-blown panic attack in the bathroom, and all these events lead to him sitting there in front of the guy, in front of the counselor, saying that A, he doesn't fit in, B, Marianne, the person that he loves, isn't there to save him, and C, his friend from home, who represents a life that he had, isn't there anymore. So he's all of these things for somebody whose mental health is fragile at the best of times. All of these things have clashed together, and what I think Alice and Sally have captured incredibly well is that I think that scene sometimes can feel like it's almost documentarian in terms of it's very still, it's very it feels like it's very tight for a lot of it. And I think gauging from responses that people have talked to me about, that it's the writing represents conversations that they've had in real life, and I think that it goes back to Sally and Alice.
There was extraordinary work in that scene. I have another audience question, and this one's from Heather Cassidy. She says, why did you choose to make the end of the series more ambiguous than the book? She says, Marianne says they don't know what will happen in a year, but the book seemed to have a more hopeful ending, saying that she would, well, implying that she would be there. What do you make of that question?
Len?
I was just about to say head. I would dispute that it's less optimistic. For sort of all sorts of reasons, but just the visual or storytelling on screen is so different to storytelling on the page. And what happens in the novel is that the email arriving with the offer to go to New York and the sort of breakup all happen they all happen in the same scene in the novel, but it's possible to go in and out of the characters' heads and to think about, and to reflect on what's occurring. And so for the purposes of what we were trying to do and to sort of make it sort of operate well on screen, we split those two things. And we felt, I suppose, that, it was important to also address the question of, why couldn't they continue their relationship remotely, as people do. People have long distance relationships. So we felt that we sort of had to at least have that conversation, that she could wait, or that she'd be there, he'd come back, and they could start again. And it just, as we developed it and as we sort of rehearsed it and talked about it and went backwards and forwards with the writers, it just felt like where it went was the place that it kind of had to go. But I still feel a deep hopefulness in the ending, which is it's about something the guy said earlier on. I think Daisy said it earlier, that they have done good for each other, that like all the way through the series, all the way through the story, there are misunderstandings and there are comings together and breakings apart, which are based on miscommunication or inability in Paul's character's case to sort of speak truthfully, or in Daisy's case to sort of feel good about herself. And at the end, even though it is a kind of breakup, it's done with love and understanding and in a fully conscious way, which recognizes the sort of significance of the relationship to both characters. So I feel that it's hopeful, and but it is probably more is said perhaps than is said in the novel. And that means that there's less perhaps wriggle room for what you might hope for as an audience member, that you're being told, oh, well, it will be okay. No, there is more said, and therefore there's less ambiguity, but I find it uplifting as an ending.
Well, now that segues perfectly into my next question, which I know is what it's going to be. And I think it's so true what you said about, it feels so, I think, so real. The characters are so real. And Ed actually said to me at one point that he kept expecting to see them in real life. They really do live in your head. And so for that reason, I think a lot of people are very invested in this conversation of what happens to them next. When is the next season? We need Sally to write something. Oh my God, there's always that pressure. But instead of asking you when that's going to happen, because I know you won't answer, I want to know what you guys would hope for Marianne and Connell in the future. I have a theory myself, but I will cede the floor to you guys.
Do you want me to have a go? So without commenting on future iterations on screen, what I think that what's kind of amazing about Sally's writing, and I think it's also what Lenny and Daisy and Paul have done, is they've created these incredibly real characters that you feel incredibly invested in. But of course, it is a story of first love, and that's part of its power. And that's, I think, why, you know, we all sort of, or many of us at least, respond to it in such a kind of strong way, because hopefully at least everyone has had a first love, you know, and that's a really powerful experience. But I think also Sally, she really tests her characters. She kind of puts them through the mill. She challenges them, but fundamentally there's such kind of humanity, and I think a kind of optimism in her work. Ultimately, you know, people come through the ringer, that I think there is a future for Marianne and Connell in some kind of fictional parallel universe. Whether that ever gets realized in any other form, I don't know, but that's in my head at least.
Anyone else? Any ideas? Lenny, I know you have thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I think I you know, having gone through the process of being so deep in this world for so long, I still think of them as like I don't think what will happen, because I know they're not real. I mean, I know that in a sort of, you know, but I think there are many truthful possible futures for those characters. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. So I think there is a world in which in 3 or 4 years' time, after they've had some time apart, they do come back together again, and they do stay together for a substantial amount of time. But I also think there's a world in which they each find a partner that makes sense, but I don't think that they would ever not be in each other's lives. And I don't know, not everybody, but some people, you know, have people in their lives who they are deeply emotionally connected to, even if they're not the person that they're with. So I think, but actually maybe the best thing to say is, or the most truthful thing to say, is that there will always be an interesting story to tell about Connell and Marianne, whether or not they're together. They will be significant to each other always. And yeah, I mean, what the form it takes is who knows.
Well, Paul and Daisy, I really hope you would consider coming back if that was ever offered. Is that something you'd be excited to do?
Oh, if it was offered 100%. But I totally agree with what Lenny and Ed are saying, in terms of, I think the next phase of their life, I totally see it as well as in isolation. And I think what's interesting about Connell and Marianne is when they're together, in a certain extent, or when they're in that world. So yeah, I agree with what Lenny and Ed said. Well done.
Daisy,
any addition to that before we wrap up?
I agree with Lenny. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd be curious to see what they'd be like as 30-year-olds, and then maybe, yeah, all through their life, I'd be curious to see, you know, how they grow and change. But yeah, I agree with Lenny and Ed.
I want to see just how romantic it is between them when they've got like 3 kids and a mortgage and they're completely exhausted.
Oh, so cynical. I just need you all to come back and keep doing this every few years at the very least. Thank you all so much. I absolutely